tonight for his Devo, so I will thank him for all of us. Appreciate the insights he shared, and I'm sure you did as well. While coming in this evening, I received a call relative to our policy on animals in our assemblies. I thought we had made this clear sometime earlier, but let me just refresh your memory. Service animals are certainly permissible. Companion animals, that's a different story. We're not interested in becoming Noah's Ark. And so there's a real difference between the two. One is certainly acceptable. The other, not so much. And so if you've had questions about that, we've just answered them again, and we'll be happy to do that again and again if it keeps coming up. But that is the policy, and we plan to abide by it. We are in our study of Daniel this evening, chapter 4, and we'll pick it up in verse 13. But let me quickly give you a speedy overview of what we've covered thus far. I mentioned at the outset that Daniel is easily divided into two sections. The first 6 chapters convey stories that are designed to build faith and remind us that God is in control. The remaining 6 chapters give detailed accounts of events that loomed on the horizon relative to Israel and God's revelation to Daniel. The first 6 chapters primarily focus on Babylon and Babylon's successor, the Medes and the Persians. Chapters 7 through 12 tell us of God's revelation in various forms to Daniel through visions and dreams, and their meaning, in essence, for the nation of Israel. In chapter 1, we're introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends. In chapter 2, we're told of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, his demand that his astrologers, soothsayers, magicians, and Chaldeans tell him what he dreamed and then what the dream meant. Of course, no human being is capable of doing such things, but the God in heaven certainly has that power and much more. And through Daniel, the king's request was met, and Daniel and his friends were then placed in influential positions throughout government. In chapter 3, we're confronted with one of the most faith-building stories in the Old Testament, and perhaps one of the most familiar in the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are cast into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar gazes into the furnace, and he sees not 3 men, but 4, loosed, walking around, and when they come out of the furnace, not a hair has been singed. There wasn't even the smell of smoke on them. They're restored to their positions, even though they refuse to bow before his image, and continue to have great influence on the government. Now in chapter 4, where we pick up our study tonight, the king has had another dream. He wants to know the meaning, but unlike the first encounter, he does not demand that they tell him what he dreamed and then what it meant. He's willing to share the dream and only asks that they tell him its meaning. The astrologers, soothsayers, magicians, and Chaldeans at his beck and call acknowledged that they couldn't even explain the meaning of the king's dream. In all probability, it was because they understood that the message was not a favorable one, and they didn't want to be put in the precarious position of telling the king something he did not want to hear. And so they declined. That brings Daniel into the picture again. He is able to interpret the meaning of the dream, and it is in the context of chapter 4 then fulfilled. And the purpose of this dream was to underscore once more that God rules in the kingdoms of men. No matter how mighty and powerful a man may be, before God, he is insignificant and powerless. Nebuchadnezzar had achieved a greatness that perhaps none in Old Testament history had achieved outside of the nation of Israel itself. He was the ruler of his world. At this time in the history of his reign, it's probably about 580, between 580 and 570. Historians tell us that during that period, Babylon had, for all intents and purposes, conquered her enemies. Nebuchadnezzar has built his city. It is a double-walled city. The circumference of the walls, 17 miles. It was surrounded by a moat. It had a large lake within the confines of the city. And of course, nearly anyone who has spent any time in history has heard of the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. No doubt Nebuchadnezzar will stand on the rooftop of one of his buildings and behold his accomplishments and think, look what I have achieved. And then God will knock him down a peg. And that's exactly what chapter 4 is all about. In the 13th verse, where we pick up our study, the text says, I saw in the vision of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher. Let me pause and tell you that this is a term that seems to be unique to this particular section of Scripture, but you learn as you read the entirety of the narrative that the watcher is also an angel, and an angel is literally a messenger, in this case a messenger of God. He is described as a holy one. He came down from heaven and he proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches. Now, if you haven't been with us and haven't read Daniel lately, let me pause and remind you that in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar had envisioned a tree that reached into the sky. It provided abundant fruit. It offered shade for the beasts of the field and obvious room for birds to nest. It was a magnificent thing. But now this watcher, a messenger or angel of God, gives the order, chop it down, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Now, I would say that this is simply the way that the depiction is given to say that this is complete and utter destruction of the tree from the ground up. When you strip it bare, cut off its branches, scatter all its fruit, that's really predicting a major fall. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Pretty obvious thing to expect if the tree is being chopped down, the branches lopped off, the leaves stripped, and everything scattered. Everything thus that the tree represented was going to be, we might say, uprooted. A dramatic change is about to occur. What could this mean? And you know that Nebuchadnezzar has experienced this dream. He remembers it vividly, and his encounter with the previous dream would lead him, I think, to assume that, again, this is about me. And it doesn't sound good. Then the record continues. The leaves, the stump, the stump and its roots. I better start looking at the screen because those letters are getting kind of small back there. but leave the stump of its root in the earth. I could put my glasses on, but then I can't even tell there are letters up there. So cut it down, cut all the branches off, strip all the leaves, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth. And the obvious thing is, and if you've had any experience in the outdoors, if the stump remains, the tree is not completely dead. And you may see from the stump and the roots a new tree actually sprout and grow. And I've seen some rather interesting things occur over the years, mostly when I was younger and spent a lot more time outdoors than I do today. And trees have a knack of not just dying off. They really strive and struggle to keep alive. And I think that what we're being told here in this dream is that the tree's cut down and it's stripped bare and scattered, but it's not over. He says to bind it with a band of iron and bronze, that is the stump and its roots. Now, obviously, here we're talking primarily about the stump being banded with iron and brass. That's a protective means to indicate that though the tree has been toppled and completely destroyed, the stump is going to remain and ultimately we learn revitalized. Then he says, amid the tender grass of the field, let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. He's talking about Nebuchadnezzar now. And we've gone from a tree to a personal pronoun. Did you notice the transition? Going from a tree to let him, meaning Nebuchadnezzar, be wet with the dew of heaven. He's going to take up residency outdoors. He will be moved out of his palace, out into the open fields, where he will be compelled to live. In this region of the world, it can get well below freezing, and temperatures can easily rise above 110. This is not going to be any fun. His portion will be the beast. He will, in essence, eat the grass of the earth. I asked you last Wednesday night to look up 2 terms. The first is zoanthropy, and the second, boanthropy. I know that Marjorie did this. I asked her if either word described Russ, and she assured me that they don't. You helped her? Don't trust that. I wouldn't trust it for a moment if you're counting on Harry, but I think you're wiser than that, Marge. Yeah. Zoanthropy describes a condition in which essentially a person thinks they're an animal. It's a psychological phenomenon where they really, truly do think that they are no longer a human being. Now, I suppose in Marietta, in our little neck of the woods, if I mentioned furries, you wouldn't have any idea of what I was talking about, would you? Well, there are young people in more populated areas, even of our state, who not only are confused about gender, but they identify themselves as furries, meaning they're animals. And I know of at least one school where they have some students who do refer to themselves as furries. I think that's more a fad than anything else. We're actually talking about real psychological issues here. And boanthropy simply means someone who identifies as a cow. You know what the word bovine is? That's the word that is at the root of this idea of one who presumes to be a cow. There's a wonderful survey of Old Testament written by R.K. I think it's R.K. Harrison, in which Dr. Harrison describes having visited a psychological institution in England in 1946 or 47, where he actually encountered a resident who believed that he was a cow. And he was given freedom to be outdoors and to graze in the plush lawns. In fact, Harrison commented that the grounds were far better kept than the institution itself, the rooms and facilities indoor. And the man simply spent his day walking around, pulling handfuls of grass out and eating them. They did provide a bowl with clean water so that he wouldn't have to drink out of ditches and dirty streams. But other than that, he lived like he was a cow. It's very, very rare, but it does happen. It seems that this is the condition that is being described relative to Nebuchadnezzar. You're this tree that's going to be toppled. And when it happens, you're going to live like an animal for 7 periods of time. Most commentators would suggest to you that these 7 periods are actually 7 years. I have read extensively. I can't begin to tell you how much time I read trying to be properly prepared for these classes. I find over and over again that the consensus is that it's 7 years, but I can't find anybody who gives me a single reason why I should accept that. And it's possible that it could be months or weeks. Days seems to be too limited given the conditions that are described. It may simply be a way of expressing a lengthy period of time. I'm just going to leave it at 7 periods of time, and I'll let you decide whether you think that's years or something less or more. But I would tell you that there's going to be an extended time in the life of Nebuchadnezzar when he's going to live like an animal. The good news is that it's not going to go on forever, and he will recover, and he will be restored. And this is not something that is unheard of, because I just gave you a literal example of a man who was suffering from the very kind of condition that is described here relative to the king. But there is hope. Remember, this stump, which represents a part of the king, has been bound in iron and brass, implying that it will be preserved and there will be a restoration. The sentence is by decree of the watchers. Again, we understand this to be messengers of God from the angelic host. The decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. You know, sometimes things happen that we don't understand. When it happens, don't get discouraged, because God's still in control. And sometimes he may place in positions of great leadership the lowliest of men, only to make us aware once more of who really is in charge. This is a done deal in essence. The holy ones who represent God have spoken for God, who rules in the kingdom of men. Daniel is saying to Nebuchadnezzar as he interprets the dream and what has been revealed, you're not as great as you think you are. God is far, far greater. And you need to come to grips with that, and you haven't yet. So God is going to knock you off your feet, bring you to your knees, and convince you that he is real, and in his sight, you are nothing. Just a mere creature of the creation. And Nebuchadnezzar really needed to learn that lesson. The dream this dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. And you, O Belteshazzar, this is Daniel's Babylonian name, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation. I suggested to you earlier that it may not be that they can't do it, they choose not to do it. Remember, this is the same man who said, tell me my dream, and if you don't, I will rip you limb from limb, and I will destroy your houses, make them dung heaps or garbage piles, and I'll eradicate your families. He's not the kind of man you mess with. You don't want to be on his bad side. And they really can't see a way of being honest with what Nebuchadnezzar has dreamed and staying in his good graces. And that's why, in my judgment, they say we're not able to make known the interpretation. But he says to Daniel, you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Now, Daniel is not a polytheist. He doesn't worship many gods. He worships the God and Father of all, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Nebuchadnezzar is not monotheistic. He's polytheistic. And he believes that the real testament to religion is to embrace as many gods as you can. Have a large pantheon. Did you know that in the first century, one of the charges leveled against Christians was that they were atheistic? You see, Christianity was born at a time when idolatry filled the land. Everyone had room to add another god to the list they worshiped. We just went through this and illustrated it in Paul's encounter at Athens with the inscription to the unknown God, the inscription that covered all their bases in case they might have missed one. And there were idols and representations of idol worship all throughout Athens. But adding another was not a big deal. And Christians, like the Jews, argued that there is one God. Well, how can you think there's only one God? That sounds like atheism. Can't you embrace all the gods that are acknowledged in the world today? Well, of course not. And so they were labeled as atheists. Nebuchadnezzar is speaking from his idolatrous perspective when he speaks of the spirit of the holy gods in you. The fact of the matter is, and Daniel made it clear in chapter 2, but we don't know how much time has elapsed from the events in chapter 2 to the events in chapter 4. But it seems Nebuchadnezzar has forgotten whatever he may have learned in that first episode, because he doesn't connect Daniel with just his God, but all the gods that are in you. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while. You see, Daniel heard Nebuchadnezzar tell his dream, and immediately he recognizes this is about him and it's not good. His thoughts alarmed him. Well, he doesn't want to have to be the bearer of bad news. Have you ever done that? Certainly nothing to this extent, but have you ever had to share bad news with someone? I have done it so many times, and I will tell you up front, it is never easy. I remember walking out of this building one evening and walking just down the street to tell someone that their mother had died. I don't know how many times I've had to do that. It's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. If you delight in doing something like that, maybe you've got some psychological problems too, because it's not something you would enjoy doing. And Daniel knows, he knows in his heart of hearts what this dream is all about, and it doesn't bode well for the king, and so he's alarmed. The king answered and said to Belteshazzar, and why would he do this? He can see on Daniel's face that he's alarmed. You can tell a great deal about someone by watching their facial expressions. That's another reason why I can't wait to get rid of these things. The eyes can reveal a lot, but not nearly as much as the entire face. And if you read the Bible carefully, you'll find that this is not the only time where someone sees someone's face and notices a dramatic change. And that's what's happened here. The king answered and said to Belteshazzar, "Let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you, because clearly you're alarmed. I can see it in your expression." So Belteshazzar answered and said, "My lord," referencing the king in proper language of the 6th century BC. The scriptures tell us in Romans 13 that we're to render honor to whom honor is due, tribute to whom tribute is due, in essence, respect to whom respect is due. And this is a respectful term used to address the king. It has no religious connotations in this setting. May the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. What he's saying is, I wish that this was about them and not about you. It would be a much better situation if we were talking about what God was going to do to your enemies than what he's going to do to you. It really is about you. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, and in whose branches the birds of heaven lived. It is you, O king. Now, let's stop for a moment and ask this question. Why do we see this repetitiveness in the record? Well, this is Daniel, and Daniel was written in the 6th century BC. And at that time, printing presses did not exist. Anything that was produced by hand, and copies were handmade, and thus books and parchments and scrolls were extremely costly, and only the very wealthy had access to them. And that's throughout all of biblical history. And in particular in the Old Testament, there is a mechanism in place that is designed as the record is revealed to reinforce the message by repetition. I tell you often that I need repetition in order to learn and to remember. The more I hear it and see it, the more likely I'm going to retain it. And that's really what is at work here. For each time we reference the dream, we get the same record, almost verbatim, and it's designed not simply to fill space. When you were in school and had to produce a term paper or some paper with 6 pages, you just copied and put in anything and everything you could and were as verbose as possible to get your pages. Well, that's not what we're dealing with here. This is designed to help people learn and remember. And repetition accomplishes that. And so we keep hearing these same things because that's how learning was achieved. Here you are, king, you're that tree. That tree that we have now had described for us, I think, 3 times. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven. This is hyperbole to say that you've achieved much. You are perhaps the greatest ruler in your realm and world today. At this time, none have surpassed you. You've achieved much. Your dominion is to the ends of the earth. And again, when we look at concepts like this, we're not thinking in terms of our globe. There was no understanding in the 6th century BC that there was a North America, a South America, an Antarctic, an Arctic. They considered the world what they knew. And as We speak of the dominion to the ends of the earth. To the world you know, you have conquered your world. You have achieved greatness. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with the band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field. If you don't know this when we're done, you've got to be sleeping through the class. I get tired of saying it, but it's the text, and it's pretty hard when you hear it over and over again not to remember it. Let his portion be with the beasts of the field till 7 periods of time pass over. Okay, we've dealt with all of that. So, what are we dealing with now? This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High. See, the watchers, the holy ones, they're not conveying their will. They're not in charge. The Most High, that is God Almighty, which has come upon my Lord the King, that you shall be driven from among men. The essence is you're going to lose your mind and be pushed out. That's a pretty frightening thing. You'll be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beast of the field. I have to tell you, I find that totally unappealing. I don't see an upside to this at all. I enjoy the outdoors, but only when I know I can come in. I don't mind animals. I can't think of an animal I dislike. Most of them, if they're properly prepared, I really like. But to live like one and to live with them, that's something that does not appeal to me at all. But that's the fate of King Nebuchadnezzar. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you till you know the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And this is repetitive as well. Daniel is saying, King, this is happening so you will come to terms with who you are and who he is. And he is great. And without him, you're nothing. And you need to learn this. And this is his way of communicating that message, because to this point, you clearly haven't gotten it. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. So with this terrible message, there is that little hope given to King Nebuchadnezzar that this is not permanent. When you finally figure things out and realize who's really in charge, know that heaven rules, that God is in control, then and not until then will you be restored. Therefore, O king, this is Daniel's counsel to Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore, O king, break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your posterity. So the king has revealed his dream. Daniel has then interpreted that dream with the aid of God. And he says, this is my advice. Clean up your act. Straighten up. Fly right. Do righteousness. Show mercy. Care for the poor. Would you be surprised if I suggested to you that the king took Daniel's advice? I believe he did, because of what I read next. What one would expect, having confronted the dream and its interpretation, is that immediately we would see Nebuchadnezzar driven from his palace to live as an animal. All of this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months. Now that I know is a year. So a year after the dream and its interpretation and Daniel's counsel to straighten up and be righteous and to treat the poor with kindness and generosity and live more like an upright, righteous man, A year later, the dream is fulfilled. That implies to me, and you don't have to accept this, I can't give you absolute certainty on it, but it implies to me that for a time, Nebuchadnezzar decided to straighten up and do right. But it's hard when you have that kind of power to not let it go to your head. And a year later, he has to deal with everything that had been predicted. And it's not good. I can't imagine going for a day without a shower. I have had to do that a couple of times, and I hate it. During the summer, it's 2 or 3 showers. And I try to keep my nails trimmed. I wash my hair every day. I have hair, by the way. I'm very thankful for that, so I try to take care of it. Living this way, that's a fate worse than death from my perspective, because at least in death I know the difficulties are over and heaven awaits. But to live like this, if that won't bring you to your senses, I don't know what will. And that's the fate that Nebuchadnezzar is about to face. We'll pick it up next week in verse 28, and Kurt will come now and share our